If you haven't heard, there's an election on August 25th, and there are 2 state questions on your ballot, State Question 844 and State Question 846. And regardless of your party affiliation, whether you're Republican, Democrat, or Independent, you get to vote in this election, and you have a say on these issues. I want to start by saying that not all state questions are created equal. Usually when we hear state questions, we think about people putting state questions on the ballot by gathering signatures. Those are called initiative petitions. State Question 846 and 844 are not initiative petitions, they are legislative referendums, which means they came from the legislature. They are on the ballot in August because lawmakers passed legislation during this past session requiring it to be on the August ballot specifically. So let's look at what lawmakers are asking people to vote on. State Question 844 is about how, if at all, local entities will be reimbursed by the state for lost revenue. Specifically, it has to do with changing the reimbursement methodology of a fund called the Ad Valorem Reimbursement Fund. Now, to simplify things, ad valorem means property taxes, and I know you all know what property taxes are. So if I say ad valorem, I need you guys to think property taxes. So to understand State Question 844, I think it's helpful to understand the historical context that created the Ad Valorem Reimbursement Fund to begin with. Knowing the history helps explain what's being changed via State Question 844. So how did the Ad Valorem Reimbursement Fund come to be? Back in the 1980s, the economic conditions in the US were not great. There was stagflation, which is high unemployment, high inflation. There was the Iranian Revolution of 1979 that shocked the oil markets and skyrocketed oil and gas prices. And there were bank failures throughout the United States. And those economic conditions were very present in Oklahoma. Oklahoma lawmakers at the time wanted to alleviate these economic circumstances. And the way they did this was by trying to attract companies to the state of Oklahoma. So in 1985, lawmakers introduced a state question, State Question 588. To create an incentive program for companies. The way this incentive would work is if companies came and set up shop in Oklahoma and they met certain capital investment requirements and employment requirements, then that company wouldn't have to pay property taxes for 5 years. Sounds like a great deal for the company. The thinking was if companies set up shop in Oklahoma, jobs will be created, investments will be made, and the economy will improve. This incentive is called the 5-year manufacturing ad valorem exemption. However, lawmakers knew that property taxes are a crucial revenue source for local entities. Think public schools, county governments, sheriff departments, emergency management services like your ambulances, and career techs. In fact, property tax revenue is the only revenue stream that stays at the local level. It never goes to the state legislature. So this incentive that was created, the manufacturing exemption, would mean that local services would no longer get the property tax revenue from those companies that were eligible for the incentive. Lawmakers at the time didn't want local services to go without that property tax revenue because the state wanted to give an incentive to companies. And so the state, and truly everyday Oklahoma taxpayers, took on the responsibility to refund localities for that lost revenue. And this is done via the Ad Valorem Reimbursement Fund. It's reimbursing localities. This was also created in 1985 via the State Question 588. So the state gives companies an incentive in the form of a 5-year exemption on their property taxes and then turns around and reimburses localities with the money from the Ad Valorem Reimbursement Fund. The reason I say taxpayers took on the responsibility of reimbursing localities is because the reimbursement fund itself is funded by 1% of all income tax revenue that the state collects. So really, Oklahoma taxpayers have been subsidizing companies in Oklahoma for 4 decades. Since 1987 to 2025, adjusted for inflation, the fund has paid out about $2.8 billion. And this incentive is available to any company that qualifies, meaning that local governments and communities do not get to decide if they want that company to reside in their county or not and receive that 5-year exemption or not. Counties and communities accept the companies because even a little economic development is deemed as good. And with State Question 588 in 1985, the legislature and the state promised to reimburse those localities fully. State question 844 is trying to go back on that promise. So what does state question 844 ask voters to do? Let me start with what it doesn't do. State question 844, regardless of whether it passes or fails in August, does not touch the 5-year property tax exemption that is provided to companies. So even if state question 844 passes, fails, whatever happens, companies that are eligible will still get the 5-year exemption. What the legislature is asking from voters is to grant blanket authority to the legislature to change the methodology that is used to reimburse localities, think schools and counties. Lawmakers do not specify in the state question language how they want to change the reimbursement methodology. They just want voters to trust that they will change it in the right way. People are concerned state question 844 will give the legislature the power to pick and choose which counties to reimburse, if they reimburse at all. And most importantly, state question 844 does not address the root of the problem, and we will see some solutions later on in this presentation. I think it's important to understand where state question 844 came from explicitly. So the ad valorem reimbursement fund has not been sufficient to make full reimbursements to local governments since 2002, meaning that 1% of income tax revenue has not been enough since 2002. The legislature has had to appropriate additional money from the general revenue fund, which is the state's budget, to ensure that the legislature meets its reimbursement obligations to local entities. Supporters of state question 844 say that the cost of the program and the state's share of the responsibility is growing, and given the pressures that are already on the state budget, having to appropriate additional money for this reimbursement fund puts strain on the state's budget even more. Supporters say that allowing the legislature to adjust the methodology next session would allow them to better manage the cost of the reimbursement program in the long term. Opponents say that it is the state's responsibility to reimburse localities, and this state question is asking voters to go back on that promise made in 1985. It is putting the fiscal burden back on localities that did not agree to the corporate incentive to begin with. Additionally, there is the question of distribution of the ad valorem fund. Specifically, one county in Oklahoma, Mays County, gets 40% of the fund amount because a single company, Google, is eligible for that much of a property tax exemption in that county. Supporters of state question 844 say that it's not fair to the rest of the counties. They say that amending the methodology is necessary to ensure fairness for all counties. Opposition would say that the reimbursement levels depend on the amount of property tax exemption given to a company in that county, and the counties are simply obeying the law and asking to be reimbursed for the amount of the exemption given by the state. Mays County is an industrial hub in Oklahoma where companies come and set up shop and are incentivized to do so, and it shouldn't be penalized for doing just that. Both sides can agree on one thing, that this incentives cost is increasing unsustainably in some years. However, there is disagreement on how to address the issue. Lawmakers don't want to change the company incentive, and instead they want to change the reimbursement methodology of a critical revenue source for local entities. Oklahoma policy suggests alternative solutions that would actually start to solve the problem. One, lawmakers could have written the state question to set reasonable limits on exceptionally large exemptions claimed by a single company so that the costs of the program don't skyrocket. Lawmakers could establish an overall cap on the program so that there's overall limitations. Third, in year 6, when companies finally have to begin to pay their own property taxes because that exemption has expired, they challenge the valuations that are set by the county assessors and get their amount drastically reduced because they have a lot of money and really good tax lawyers. And this causes large fluctuations in local revenue, which harms schools and bond projects. Lawmakers could change the incentive a little bit so that companies have skin in the game from the very beginning, not just when the incentive expires and companies have to begin to pay their taxes. And lastly, lawmakers could ensure that the ad valorem department in the Oklahoma Tax Commission is more involved with the assessment process of these properties if they feel the need for more transparency. So lawmakers already have options available to them to solve problems or begin to solve the problems. All that to say, lawmakers could have written a state question that actually addresses the issue, the unsustainable growth of the incentive, instead of putting local revenue and services at risk and asking for blanket authority to change whatever they want.